Ukraine is known for quite a few things: vast wheat fields, Orthodox churches, the deepest subway in the world, and its Slavic culture, among other things. Sandwiched between the West and East, Ukraine's position is quite strategic geopolitically, and it has been historically as well. As a nation decides it's now a Western democracy, it is important to understand the history of the country, both farther back in time and more recently, to determine the origin of the nation of Ukraine and its current situation. For simplicity, we'll call the beginning of Ukrainian history the Kievan Rus. We'll skip over Greek settlements in the Azov Sea, and the Huns, and the Avars, and so on, because they aren't actually East Slavs. Anyway, the Kievan Rus formed sometime in the early Middle Ages, but grew to great prominence in the 9 to 1000s AD. It covered a very large area in Eastern Europe, including Kiev, obviously, and much of modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Poland and Russia. East Slavs generally consider this kingdom to be the direct ancestor of their respective nations. Byzantine Christianity was brought to the kingdom by Vladimir the Great, known for ruling the state's golden age. Kiev kept its power through the reign of Vladimir's son, Yaroslav the Wise. After his death, certain regional powers started popping up within the kingdom because they didn't like a central government telling them what to do. Kiev was sacked by the Mongols in 1240, along with the rest of the Rus states that formerly made the great East Slavic state. Despite a few resurgences of power during the 11 and 1200s, Kiev never regained its previous power during its golden age. While much of central and western Ukraine, including the city of Kiev, remained under the control of Poland and Lithuania, the southern coast was under the control of the Crimean Khanate, ruled by the Turkic-speaking Crimean Tatars, which we'll come back to. Anyway, back to the rest of Ukraine. Having been under the control for some 200 years by Poland and Lithuania, in 1569 the two states officially united and formed the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Both Lithuanians and Ukrainians experienced some Polonization, or the Polish forcing non-Polish people to become Polish during the Commonwealth's rule. Parts of western Ukraine became Catholic under Polish rule. However, many Ukrainians, most notably the Cossacks, were resistant to these cultural changes and were not afraid to attack the government for this. Remember when I said we'd come back to the Crimean Khanate? Well, the Crimeans were pretty geared up for war, considering their Mongol origin, and loved nothing more than plundering their neighbors, and Ukraine was no exception. They were a pain in the ass for both Poland, Lithuania, and Russia for quite a bit of time, until Russia finally decided to pull the reverse card and defeated Crimea in 1783. The Zaporozhian and Dnieper Cossacks cannot be forgotten in their help of destroying Crimea. Speaking of the Cossacks, they asked the Polish government nicely to give them representation and let Ukraine have its own culture. And the nobles were like, nah, fuck you guys, which just made the Cossacks fight some more. There were actually a lot of these little things called Cossack uprisings, the most important of which being in 1648, which created the Cossack Hetmanate, basically an independent mini-Ukraine. However, by the late 1700s, the Polish Commonwealth got eaten by Prussia, Austria, and Russia, and the latter also decided to eat the Hetmanate for dessert. Though Ukrainian people fared alright under the Russian Empire's rule, their language was not allowed to be used very much, because Russification and stuff. Some nationalist movements grew in Ukraine during the 1800s, but they didn't amount to much in the end, as people were too busy moving to Crimea and surrounding areas to make it less Turkic. A few Ukrainians, more like 2 million of them, decided to move out to Central Asia and Siberia to begin new lives in the most miserable and cold lands ever. Parts of Russian-controlled Manchuria became so Ukrainian, they had to name it Green Ukraine, because of all the solar panels there. Just kidding, climate activists didn't exist back then. With the outbreak of World War I, Ukrainians could finally take advantage of the shifty situation and make their own country. And it worked, sort of. The Russian Empire died of monarch failure, and Austria-Hungary, where a few Ukrainians also lived, collapsed too. Ukraine was pretty much independent from 1918 to 1919, but like most of the rest of Europe at the time, its people were pretty geared up for war again, and its left-winger communists started fighting the anarchists. The anarchists were basically f***ed from the start because the commies had the Bolsheviks in Russia backing them. The anarchist resistance fell apart in 1921. Parts of western Ukraine were captured by respawned Poland in its war against the Bolsheviks, making Ukraine once again divided. In 1922, Ukraine became a Soviet Socialist Republic, uniting it with a few other SSRs to create this USSR. Interwar Soviet Ukraine was probably the absolute worst place on Earth to live at that time, Aside from over 1 million people dying in the war, Stalin set up collective farms in Ukraine during the 30s and didn't allow any of the people living there to have any grain. Several million people ended up starving to death. This dark time in Ukraine's history is called the Holodomor, and is recognized as a genocide in Ukraine and a few other countries, because Stalin asked unrealistic outputs of the collective farmers and didn't give them anything if they didn't meet the quota. The beginning of the Second World War didn't really help Ukraine either, because they were caught in the crossfire on the Eastern Front. Though several million Ukrainians fought in the Red Army, a few partisan groups made of Ukrainians actually allied with the Nazis against the USSR. The Reich set up a Ukrainian puppet state in 1941, and though many people saw the Germans as liberators, they, being socialists as well, decided to be mean and do the same collectivist farm crap the Soviets did. In total, death counts from civilians and military is upwards of 7 million, including 1.5 million Jews killed in death camps. After World War II, things were still grim, but not completely tragic. There were lots of rebuilding efforts, as there were so many cities destroyed by the war. The UN inducted the Ukrainian SSR as a founding member in 1945, which is kinda unfair when you learn that the Soviet Union actually had triple representation power because Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus were all members. Things really started looking up for Ukraine after Stalin's death in 1953, with Khrushchev becoming the new premier of the Soviet Union, and also being the former leader of the Ukrainian SSR himself. He was fond of the land he ruled and transferred Crimea from the Russian SSR to the Ukrainian one, and this will become important later for, well, reasons. Ukraine became kind of important in the USSR, with many astronauts, athletes, scientists, artists, and leaders calling it home. Leonid Brezhnev, the leader following Khrushchev, was not only from Ukraine, but an ethnic Ukrainian himself. Now, for Ukraine's most famous moment. In 1986, when the USSR was about to crumble because its population wanted McDonald's in their borders, their superior technology caused the most severe nuclear reactor disaster ever. Just fantastic, the Communist Party science department is. However, it could have been much worse, if not for a lot of brave people who went in there to reduce its effects as best as they could. When the Soviet Union was really on its last legs in 1991, Ukraine fully declared its independence on December 8th, where its leaders met with others from Russia and Belarus to dissolve the USSR completely. Afterwards, all former SSRs, except for the Baltics, as they saw their time under Soviet rule as an illegal occupation, created the Commonwealth of Independent States. The Ukrainian economy entered a recession following independence until 1996 with the introduction of their new currency. The Constitution of Ukraine was written, and today Ukraine remains one of the only democratic nations of the former SSRs, along with the Baltics and Moldova, though the Baltics are much more free than either Ukraine or Moldova. Now why is that? Well, Ukraine's got a corruption problem, and its people have protested about that and a few other things quite a few times. In 2004, Viktor Yanukovych, then Prime Minister of Ukraine, and backed by Russian leadership, was said to have won that year's presidential election, but it was proven later that the elections were rigged. The real winner was Viktor Yushchenko, yes, similar names but much different people, who was actually poisoned after Yanukovych's false victory was discovered. The Orange Revolution, a wave of peaceful protests, happened after these events, and eventually Yushchenko became president in the end. This, however, did not stop pro-Russian Yanukovych from trying to gain the presidency, which was achieved in 2010, legally this time, with a plurality of the votes. However, he basically reversed the progress Ukraine had been making with growing closer to the European Union, sparking the Euromaidan protests in November 2013. Unrest grew as Yanukovych became more authoritarian in his rule until being completely ousted on February 22, 2014. One day later, Russia invaded Crimea, effectively starting its ongoing war with Ukraine. Oleksandr Turchinov was acting president until June 7th, when Petro Poroshenko became the next president. During this time, Ukrainians became strongly pro-European and pro-NATO. Under the current administration of Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky and Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal lead the Servants of the People political party, which is based on pro-European populist beliefs, along with corruption fighting, supported by most of the population. Ukraine's position is awfully strategic in global affairs, with it having a long border with Russia and its main partner Belarus. This could be advantageous for European allies to have to keep Russia at bay, but Ukraine's full admission into Western groups such as the EU and NATO worries current members, as they don't want to be dragged into a war. But who knows, NATO integrated West Germany when things were tense in the 50s. Ukraine is a country with a complicated but rich history, filled with times of great power, division, tragedy, and regrowth. It's quite fascinating and is definitely a place where I will visit in the future.